If you ever see a banner on a website that says, "Needy girls near you," don't click it under any circumstances. My name is Dennis. To anyone observing me from the outside, I'd probably seem like the embodiment of an average guy. 37 years old, single, working in a generic office cubicle with no aspirations beyond paying the bills at the end of the month. My life felt so unremarkable that sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if anyone would even notice if I simply disappeared. My routine was the same every day. Wake up late, rush to work, fake smiles at colleagues I couldn't stand, and lock myself away at home the moment my shift ended. At night, my only company was the bluish glow of my computer screen. Social media, random forums, and of course those adult websites that distracted me from the monotony and, for a fleeting moment, made the emptiness feel a little less consuming. But that night was different. I was exhausted mentally more than physically. Maybe it was the accumulated months of solitude or the crushing monotony of my existence. As I browsed an adult video site, a banner caught my attention. "Needy girls near you? Find out who's waiting for you." Of course, I'd seen ads like this before. Promises of perfect women looking for average guys like me. Usually, I ignored them, fully aware they were bait for spam sites or scams. But something about that moment, perhaps the oppressive silence of my apartment or the way the words seemed directed at me, made me click. The site had an old-fashioned vibe, almost as if it had been pulled from the early 2000s internet. A black background with flashing red letters that were irritating to look at. An auto-playing soundtrack, a distorted, soft jazz tune, added to the discomfort. There was nothing modern about it. Everything seemed deliberately poorly made. The title read, "Real Connections for Lonely People." Part of me wanted to close the tab and forget the whole thing, but I hesitated. The outdated design was almost comical, and curiosity began to take hold. A simple form appeared. Username, age, and email. That's it. No personal questions, no hassle. What harm could it do? I muttered as I typed. I picked a generic username, Dennis37, and completed the registration. The page loaded quickly and presented me with a list of profiles. The faces on the screen were attractive, but unsettling. Women with smiles that seemed off, but that's normal even on Instagram these days. Something about the light in their eyes or the tilt of their heads made each photo look like a poorly drawn painting trying to appear realistic. Some profiles didn't even have complete information, just names and generic descriptions like, "I love chatting with interesting people," or "looking for someone special." And then she appeared. Lila, that was her name. Her photo showed a blonde woman with green eyes that seemed to glow on the screen. Unlike the other photos, hers was strangely sharp, as if it had been taken at that exact moment. Before I could click on her profile, a chat window popped up in the bottom right corner. "Lila, hi, Dennis. I'm so glad you're here." Smiling face with smiling eyes. For a moment, my heart raced. Not because of the flirting, but because of how the system seemed to know my name before I'd even interacted with any profile. I knew it was just a simple algorithm pulling my username, but it didn't stop the unease. "Hi," I replied. My response was short, almost robotic. This wasn't my first time using dating sites or anything similar, but there was something different here. The way her message came through immediately, without hesitation, made me wonder if there really was someone typing on the other side, or just a bot. "Lila, you seem like an interesting person. What brought you here?" "Interesting?" I chuckled softly. Interesting was definitely not a word I'd used to describe myself. Still, she seemed to know exactly what to say. Her approach was natural, unassuming, the kind of thing that makes you want to keep talking. Just curiosity. "And you?" I typed. She took a few seconds to respond, which was odd considering how quickly she had typed before. "Lila, curiosity too. And loneliness. I guess we're all a little lonely, aren't we?" Her words struck a chord. Even if it was just a generic line, the implied honesty disarmed me. I leaned back in my chair, hesitating about how to continue. Maybe this was exactly what I wanted to hear. Someone who understood, however superficially, what it felt like to carry that emptiness every day. We kept chatting for a few minutes. Her replies were always quick and straightforward, but there was something about them I couldn't quite place. It was as if each message was carefully calculated to hold my attention. By the end of the conversation, she suggested we talk again the next day. And before I could respond, she sent one last message. "Lila, I'll be waiting, Dennis. Don't be late." Smiling face with smiling eyes. There was something subtly threatening about that, "don't be late," though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. I closed the site and turned off the computer, but as I tried to sleep, Lila's green eyes seemed etched into my mind. I woke up the next day with a strange feeling. It wasn't exactly anxiety, but something like the restlessness you feel before an important test or an unavoidable appointment. I tried to brush it off, but the thought of Lila lingered in my mind like a song you can't forget. At work, while my colleagues chatted about soccer or the latest trending series, I found myself checking my phone repeatedly. Not that I expected a message from her. Our contact was limited to the site, but the anticipation made me act like a foolish teenager. It was embarrassing to admit, but it had been so long since anyone, even a complete stranger, had given me this kind of attention. As soon as I got home that night, my usual routine felt meaningless. I couldn't focus on anything. I tried watching a series, but the characters' lines seemed distant, disconnected. Finally, I gave in to my curiosity and turned on the computer. The site loaded slowly, as always. The black background and red letters still bothered me, but at that moment, the outdated design felt irrelevant. The moment I logged in, a new message from Lila was already waiting for me. "Lila, hi, Dennis. I've been thinking about you." "Of course you have," I thought, smirking to myself. It was so easy to get swept away, so easy to forget that there was probably something wrong with all of this. Yet I replied, "Hi, Lila. How was your day?" The response came almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting for me. "Lila, better now that you're here." Smiling face with smiling eyes. That made me pause for a moment. It was the kind of cliché anyone could say to seem charming. But with her, it felt genuine, almost comforting. The conversations that night followed the same pattern. Light-hearted at first, with Lila always leading, but gradually growing deeper. She wanted to know about me, my routine, my hobbies. The more we talked, the more it felt like she was piecing together an invisible puzzle, as if every answer was essential for understanding who I was. Eventually, she steered the conversation to a more personal topic. "Lila, have you ever felt like no one truly knows you, Dennis?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. Of course, I'd felt that way, but hearing it from her was unsettling. "All the time," I replied. I hesitated before typing, and when I finally sent it, it felt as though I'd admitted something I usually kept locked away. "Lila, I knew it. I think that's why we're talking. You understand what it's like, and so do I." At that moment, I started to wonder if she was being genuine. There was something about the way she communicated that felt too specific, almost tailor-made for me. It only fueled my doubts. Who was Lila, really? Deep down, I knew I should be suspicious. It didn't make sense. A woman like her, smart, beautiful, articulate, spending time on a guy like me. And yet, I couldn't pull away. Hours passed before she finally said something that made me stop typing. "Lila, Dennis, I was thinking, why don't we meet in person?" I stared at the message. The invitation felt natural, almost inevitable. Even so, my mind raced with all the possibilities. A scam, a cruel prank, someone else behind the screen, maybe even laughing at me as I seriously considered it. I took a deep breath before replying. "I don't know, Lila. It's complicated," I said. Her response came at lightning speed, as if she'd already anticipated my hesitation. "Lila, complicated why? We've been talking for days, and I feel like there's a real connection here. Don't you?" Connection. That word echoed in my mind. Of course, I felt something, but that didn't mean it was real. I hesitated. There were so many reasons to decline, so many excuses I could give. But at the same time, there was that part of me, that empty, hungry part, that wanted to believe she was different. "What if you don't like me?" I asked. It was the only thing I could manage to type. It was more than just insecurity. It was a reflection of years of rejection and disappointment. This time, her response took longer. A few minutes passed before the chat window blinked again. "Lila, I already like you, Dennis. And if we don't meet, there'll always be that what if between us. Don't you think it's worth a try?" Her logic was flawless, even if something still nagged at me. She seemed so confident, so determined, as if she'd planned every word to convince me. Finally, I gave in. "All right, where and when?" I asked. Almost immediately, she sent a location. A local restaurant, the kind you'd find on any corner. Nothing fancy or suspicious, just simple. "Lila, tomorrow at 8 p.m. Can you make it?" "I can," I replied. When I closed the site, the uneasiness remained, but I couldn't ignore the spark of excitement flickering beneath it all. It was insane, I knew that, but for the first time in what felt like forever, something was happening in my life. Something outside the suffocating monotony of my routine. I lay in bed, trying to push away the conflicting thoughts. As sleep began to take over, I imagined what it would be like to see Lila in person. I didn't know what to expect, but somehow, it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite define. The restaurant was smaller than I remembered. Not that I'd been there often, but something about the soft lighting and worn leather seats made the place feel cozy, almost familiar. The walls were decorated with old paintings, landscape portraits that looked like they came from a generic catalog, and the muffled sound of conversations in the background created a comfortable atmosphere. I was nervous, the kind of nervous that makes your palms sweat and your heart race like a fast-paced song. No matter how much I tried to convince myself this was just a casual meeting, I couldn't ignore the weight of my expectations. I arrived a few minutes before 8 p.m. and sat at a table near the window. Outside, light rain had started to fall, tiny droplets streaking the glass in slow, winding trails. The waitress, a kind-looking middle-aged woman, took my order for a coffee, something to keep my hands busy while I waited. And then she walked in. Lila. I recognized her immediately, yet at the same time it felt impossible that it was really her. She was even more stunning than in her photos. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes seemed even more vivid under the warm, yellowish light of the restaurant. She wore a simple but elegant dress that seemed to mold perfectly to her figure. When our eyes met, she smiled, and in that instant, my nervousness was replaced by a kind of childlike enchantment. "Hi, Dennis," she said as she approached. Her voice was soft, almost hypnotic, and there was something about the way she said my name that made it feel like we were old friends. "Hi, Lila," I managed to reply, trying not to come off as a complete idiot. I stood up to greet her, but I wasn't sure what to do with my hands. She quickly resolved that by pulling me into a hug. Her perfume was sweet and slightly floral, but there was a faint note of something I couldn't place. Something metallic, maybe. We sat down, and the silence that would normally feel awkward felt natural with her. "You look exactly like I imagined," she said, crossing her legs and leaning her elbows on the table. Her eyes stayed fixed on mine, intensely focused, as if she were studying every detail of my face. "I hope that's a good thing," I said, trying to break the tension with a smile. She laughed. A light, musical sound that put me at ease. "Of course it is. I think I'm very lucky to have found you." "Lucky? To find me?" The waiter brought her order. A glass of red wine she seemed to have chosen without even looking at the menu. She took a small sip, her movements almost theatrical, before looking back at me. The conversation flowed more naturally than I had expected. Lila was funny, intelligent, and knew exactly what to say to make me feel comfortable. But something about her questions felt strange. "Have you always been this way, Dennis?" So, observant? I frowned. I'm not sure. I guess so. Why? She shrugged, playing with the edge of her glass. Just curious. I like that about you. It was a compliment, but the way she said it made me feel like I was being analyzed. Another moment that threw me off was when she asked about my childhood. Did you have a happy childhood? She asked, leaning in a little closer. Well, I guess it was normal, I replied hesitantly. Nothing too special. Why do you ask? She smiled, but her eyes didn't follow suit. I like to understand people, especially those who interest me. The phrase seemed harmless, but the way she said it left me uneasy. There was something in her tone, a trace of something deeper that I couldn't quite identify. Even so, it was impossible not to be captivated by her. Every movement she made seemed choreographed, every word calculated to make me feel special. And it worked. For the first time in years, I felt seen, as though someone genuinely cared about me. When the bill arrived, Lila insisted on paying. It's the least I can do for someone so charming, she said, winking at me. I laughed, flustered, felt like being trapped in a dream too perfect to be real. As we left the restaurant, the rain had stopped, leaving a fresh scent in the air. Lila moved closer, holding onto my arm in a way that felt almost possessive. I had a great time, she said, her eyes locked onto mine. I hope you did too. I did, I admitted, feeling a mixture of euphoria and unease. Good, she replied, tightening her grip on my arm. Because this is just the beginning. There was something about the way she said that, a calm certainty almost unnerving. But before I could dwell on it, she smiled again, and that smile swept away all my doubts, at least for the moment. The night was humid and quiet as we walked outside. The scent of wet earth lingered in the air, and puddles reflected the amber glow of the streetlights. Lila still clung to my arm, and I felt torn between the warmth of her closeness and a vague sense of discomfort, as if something was slightly out of place. I hope you don't mind, she said, turning to me with that enchanting smile. But I was thinking, how about we continue our conversation somewhere quieter? Quieter? I asked, surprised. My place, she replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It's nearby. I promise I won't kidnap you. She laughed, and I forced a smile, though her invitation unsettled me. It wasn't common for a woman like Lila to invite someone like me to her house on the first date. Felt too fast, almost artificial. I don't know, I began hesitating. It's kind of late and... Oh, Dennis, she interrupted, lightly squeezing my arm. Don't make me beg. Just a glass of wine and more conversation. Nothing more, I promise. Her eyes sparkled with something that seemed genuine, though there was an intensity that kept me on edge. My gut screamed that this was a bad idea, but before I could resist, I nodded. Okay, but just for a little while, I replied. She smiled triumphantly and began leading me down the sidewalk. Her place was anything but nearby. We walked for nearly 20 minutes through increasingly deserted streets. Lila seemed cheerful, chatting about how much she loved the quiet neighborhood. I tried to listen, but my attention was fixed on our surroundings. Poorly lit streets, tall trees casting shadows that stretched like claws across the asphalt. When we finally arrived, I stopped in my tracks, stunned. It was a mansion. The building had an imposing air, with weathered stone columns and tall windows covered by heavy curtains. The garden was overgrown, with weeds sprouting between the stones of the walkway. A single porch light illuminated the front, casting a pale, cold glow over the dark wooden door. Wow, I murmured, unable to hide my surprise. You live here alone? Lila laughed, unlocking the door with an old-fashioned key that looked like it belonged to another century. Yes, she said, pushing the door open. I inherited the house from my grandparents. It's far too big for just me, but I like it. It has personality, you know. I didn't know. Everything about the house gave me an odd feeling, as though time itself had stopped inside. Lila led me into the living room, flipping on a few lights. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, and the furniture was made of dark wood. An ornate chandelier swayed slightly, even though there was no breeze. The walls were adorned with paintings, old portraits of people who seemed to watch me with glassy eyes. "Make yourself comfortable," Lila said, kicking off her shoes and disappearing into another room. I sank into the couch, which sagged slightly under my weight. As I waited, I took a closer look around. There was a faint smell of mildew mixed with something sweet, maybe Lila's perfume. On the coffee table, I noticed an antique pocket watch stopped at 3:13 and a set of black and white photographs in picture frames. None of the photos appeared to include Lila. "You like red wine, right?" she asked, reappearing with 2 glasses and a bottle in hand. "Yes, I do," I replied, even though that wasn't entirely true. She poured the glasses and sat beside me, so close I could feel the warmth of her skin. Lila raised her glass, fixing me with that intense gaze. "A toast," she said, clinking her glass lightly against mine. "A toast to what?" I asked, forcing a smile. "To new connections," she replied, taking a sip. As we drank, the conversation started flowing again. Lila was as charming as ever, but there was something about her behavior that seemed more calculated now. Her gestures were smooth but deliberate. Her eyes didn't linger off mine for long, as if she were studying me. "So, Dennis," she said, setting her glass on the table, "do you think your life feels complete?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm not sure," I answered hesitantly. "I guess I'm trying to find something that gives it meaning." She smiled, leaning in closer. "I know what you mean. Sometimes it feels like we're just waiting for something or someone to change everything, doesn't it?" I nodded, unsure of what to say. Lila was fascinating, but her words always seemed to carry something deeper, something I couldn't grasp. The silence between us began to grow. She moved even closer, and her hand touched mine, warm and firm. My heart raced. "You're special, Dennis," she whispered. "I think I've always known that." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the house. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me turn my head. Something like the creak of a distant door. "It's fine," Lila said quickly, squeezing my hand. "This house is old. It makes strange noises sometimes." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was very wrong. "Why don't we relax a bit more?" she suggested, her smile seemingly comforting but carrying a weight I couldn't quite decipher. Lila stood up gracefully, holding the wine bottle in one hand while adjusting her hair with the other. "Let me refill your glass," she said, smiling as if she knew something I didn't. I hesitated for a moment but extended my glass. Maybe it was the atmosphere or the way she spoke, but something inside me screamed to refuse. Even so, my desire to be polite and maybe a little bolder than I actually was won out. "Thank you," I murmured, watching the ruby liquid flow smoothly into the glass, almost hypnotic. She sat back down beside me, so close I could feel the tips of her hair brushing my arm. "I think I like you, Dennis," she said, swirling the glass between her fingers. I tried to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. Everything about her was so intense. The unflinching gaze, the smile that seemed to hold a secret, the way her voice seemed to envelop the room. I took a sip of the wine, hoping to ease the mounting tension. "You're quiet," she continued, leaning in slightly. "That's rare these days. People talk too much, but you listen. Maybe I just don't know what to say," I joked, trying to sound casual. "That's charming too," she replied, laughing softly. We kept talking, but something in me began to shift. It wasn't the wine, not like I was used to, anyway. This felt different, a slow and heavy sensation, like my body was sinking into quicksand. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind seemed to lose its ability to process what she was saying. Lila's words became distant, fragmented sounds, as if I were hearing them through a tunnel. "What?" I started to speak, but my voice was weak. She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something almost predatory. "It's okay, Dennis. You're just relaxing. Let yourself go." I tried to lift my hand, but it felt like it was made of lead. The weight was overwhelming, and my vision started to dissolve into indistinct blurs. Lila was still smiling, but now there was something disturbing in that smile. Something that seemed to mock me with a secret I didn't understand. "You're so special," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as if it came from multiple directions at once. My head fell back, and the world began to darken. The last thing I saw was Lila leaning over me, her lips moving with words I couldn't comprehend. Everything went black. In the void, sounds began to emerge. First, soft footsteps like someone walking barefoot on old wood. Then, the creak of a door opening with a long, drawn-out groan. And then laughter. It wasn't Lila's light, charming laugh, but something deeper, darker, inhuman, like a deranged movie psychopath. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Then I was gone again. I woke up with a sharp pain in my head, as if a hammer had struck directly at its center. My mouth was dry, and a bitter taste lingered in my throat. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Mold, rust, and something heavier, like rotting meat. I tried to open my eyes, but my vision was blurry, as if a veil of mist covered them. Slowly, I managed to focus on what appeared to be a damp stone wall, slick with trails of slimy moss. The floor beneath me was hard, cold, and uneven, and I realized I was lying in the corner of a small, claustrophobic space. With great effort, I sat up, my muscles feeling as heavy as lead. When my vision cleared, I saw the faint light of a dim bulb swaying slightly from the ceiling. Its weak glow cast shifting shadows that danced across the walls. It was a cell. The rusted bars of the door were secured with a heavy padlock, and chains lay scattered on the floor, some bolted to the walls, as if waiting to be used. "Hey, you're awake." The voice came from a dark corner to my left. I turned my head slowly and saw a figure huddled in the opposite corner. It was a man, gaunt, with hollow eyes and disheveled hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He watched me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. What's happening?" My voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Welcome to hell," he said, letting out a bitter laugh. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as if made of paper. I looked around and realized we weren't alone. Other people were in the room, some in even worse condition. A man with a cast on his leg groaned softly, while a wide-eyed woman murmured to herself, rocking back and forth. "Where are we?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Somewhere you don't want to be," the man in the corner replied. "I don't know where, but that doesn't matter. What matters is what they're going to do to you." What do you mean by they?" He looked at me as if I were an idiot. "You really don't know, do you? They got you." Before I could ask who they were, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the cell. Muffled voices reached my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay invisible, but the sound grew closer. "Stay quiet," the man in the corner whispered. The footsteps stopped, and the voices became clearer. I couldn't see who was speaking, but their tone was serious. "How many are ready for tomorrow?" 3. 1 for the surgeon and 2 for the buyers. "We need to clear this section before the new ones arrive." My breath caught in my throat. The words started to make sense, but my mind refused to process their meaning. "We can't afford delays. The client from out of town is waiting. You know what happened last time?" "Yes, sir." The footsteps resumed, fading into the distance, and the corridor returned to silence. "Trafficking," the man next to me said, breaking the quiet. "Organs, people, whatever makes money." My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, unable to process what I was hearing. This can't be. This is insane. He shrugged. You think you're the first? We all thought that at first. Then reality hits you. These guys don't mess around. Panic consumed me. My mind raced back to Lila, her charming smile, the wine, the invitation to her home. It all felt like a game now, a carefully laid trap. How do we get out of here? I asked, my voice trembling. The man laughed, a dry and bitter sound. If you figure it out, let me know. Until then, the only way out is through the door. And it only opens for them. I looked at the cell bars and the stone walls. Everything seemed solid, impenetrable. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air felt heavier with each passing second. In the corner, the murmuring woman began speaking louder. Her words were disjointed but desperate. They're coming. They're coming. They always come. The man snorted. Well, now you understand. Welcome to the slaughter line. I stayed silent, staring at the cold floor. Each piece of information hit like a blow, and reality began to solidify around me like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The hours that followed were a blur of despair and confusion. Sitting on the cold cell floor, I tried to process what was happening. It was like being trapped in a bad dream, but the smell of mold and the constant ache in my body reminded me it was all too real. My eyes wandered around the room, studying the other prisoners. Each seemed to be at a different stage of resignation. Some had expressionless faces, showing no reaction to their surroundings, while others trembled constantly, murmuring incomprehensible words. And then I saw her, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, sat near the opposite wall. Her arms crossed over her knees and her gaze fixed on something invisible. Unlike the others, she seemed alert, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and determination. I mustered the courage to speak, starting with the man who had explained the basics to me earlier. Who is she? I asked, nodding toward the young woman. He followed my gaze and shrugged. Amanda. She's been here a few days. Good luck talking to her. She's not exactly friendly. Ignoring his warning, I stood, still dizzy but determined. I needed answers and maybe allies. Slowly, I walked over to her, trying not to appear threatening. Hey, I began, keeping my voice low. She lifted her eyes, narrowing them as if assessing whether I was worth her time. If you're here to ask for advice or tell me everything will be fine, save your breath, she said curtly. That's not it, I countered, trying to sound confident. I just want to understand what's going on. I just got here. She scoffed but didn't look away. You really don't know? This place is a human assembly line. They take you, figure out what's worth the most, your organs, your physical strength, or your entire life, and sell it to the highest bidder. And don't think anyone out there is coming to save you. Her words hit me like a brick. Even though the man in the cell had said something similar, hearing it from her with such certainty made it all feel more real. So, what do we do? I asked. Amanda tilted her head, a faint, cynical smile appearing on her lips. Most people sit here, waiting for the worst to happen. Some try to fight and end up worse than they started. And others, she paused, her eyes darkening. Well, others disappear. I sat down beside her, trying to absorb everything. And you? Are you just waiting? No, she replied firmly. I'm waiting for the right opportunity. Opportunity for what? She glanced sideways at me, weighing whether I was trustworthy. After a few seconds, she sighed. To escape, a fragile spark of hope ignited within me. Do you have a plan? I asked, almost desperate. Some ideas, she admitted, but nothing concrete yet. These bastards know what they're doing. They control everything, food, water, even the damn lights. It's not easy. I thought of Lila and how I'd been lured into this nightmare. The idea that someone had manipulated my every step was unbearable. How do they pull this off? I asked, more to myself than to her. Their network is bigger than you think, Amanda said, her voice low but seething with anger. They have contacts everywhere, Corrupt cops, doctors, even leaders of satanic cults. It's a machine, and we're the products. As she spoke, fragments of conversations from the other prisoners began to make sense. I overheard bits of stories about people who had been tricked like me. Promises of love, work, even adventures. Others had simply been abducted. Why you? I asked Amanda, curious. She hesitated for a moment before answering. I was a waitress. A guy started coming to my work, leaving generous tips, asking questions. He seemed like a good catch. One day he asked me out. The next thing I remember, I woke up here. So they study you, she interrupted. They know what to say, how to lure you in. They have an entire network to find people like us. People no one will miss. A knot formed in my stomach. That was it. Forgettable, invisible people with no one to look for them. Are you with me or not? Amanda asked, pulling me back to the present. With you for what? Planning an escape, she said, her voice full of determination. I'm not going to die here, or be sold like a piece of meat. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. But as I looked around at the desperate faces of the others, I realized that doing nothing meant accepting the fate they had planned for me. I'm with you, I replied. Amanda nodded, a flicker of hope crossing her eyes. Good, because we're going to need all the help we can get. As our conversation continued, we began discussing the details of the environment. Guard patrols, meal times, anything that could be used to our advantage. It was just the beginning, but for the first time since waking up in that place, I felt a spark of resistance. I didn't know if we would succeed, but I knew we couldn't just sit and wait for death. The days in that hell were a mixture of monotony and growing tension. Amanda and I continued our whispered conversations, trying to piece together a plan that still seemed impossible. At the same time, I carefully observed every move the guards made, every detail of our surroundings. And during one of those observations, I saw her. Lila. I was sitting in the corner of the cell, pretending to be apathetic, a skill that had become second nature to everyone there. The corridor outside was busier than usual. Voices echoed, and hurried footsteps disrupted the typical silence. When I stood and approached the bars, it felt as though the world had stopped for a moment. She was there, standing beside two men. Unlike the smiling, alluring Lila I thought I knew, she now seemed empty. Her face was serious, and her green eyes, which once seemed warm, were now as cold as ice. She spoke quietly, but her tone was sharp and controlled. This can't keep happening, she said, pointing at one of the men. The clients don't like delays. If we keep stalling, we'll lose important contracts. The man muttered something in response, but Lila shook her head impatiently. I've already told you, I don't care about the details. Fix it. I stood there, frozen, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Lila wasn't just bait. She was a key player in this horrific scheme. My mind reeled. Her smile, her engaging conversations, the perfect dinner. It had all been an act. I was just another pawn in her game, another fool to be manipulated. When she finished speaking, the men walked away, and Lila began to stroll down the corridor. Her steps were firm, almost predatory. As she passed by our cell, I acted on impulse, moving toward the bars. Lila! She stopped immediately, turning toward me. Her gaze met mine, and for a moment the silence was absolute. Why? I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief and anger. Why are you doing this? She looked at me as if she were studying an insect, tilting her head slightly. Then, slowly, she stepped closer to the bars, just a few inches away. Why? She repeated, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Do you really want to know? I didn't reply, unable to look away. Because you're weak, Dennis, she said, her words as sharp as blades. Because people like you make this easy. So desperate for attention, so ready to believe anything. I didn't even have to try. She smirked, her voice dripping with disdain. People like all of you here disgust me. You're good for nothing but slaughter and merchandise. You, my voice faltered, but the anger inside me burned brighter. Did you think you were special? That there was some connection between us? She laughed, a dry, cruel sound. You were just a job, a simple one at that. Men like you are predictable, pathetic. Her words hit me like punches, each syllable making the air around me feel heavier. You didn't have to do this, I muttered, feeling the betrayal like a knife in my chest. Oh, but I did, she replied, leaning even closer. Her eyes bore into mine, gleaming with something that could only be described as pure contempt. You know what's the most amusing part of all this, Dennis? You still want to believe I'm the same woman who held your hand that night, who looked into your eyes and told you were special. But that woman never existed. You're nothing but a pathetic, miserable creature. She stepped back, but not before giving me one last cold, calculating look. Enjoy what little time you have left, because frankly, it won't be much. Without another word, she turned and continued down the corridor, her footsteps echoing until they faded into silence. I stood there, gripping the bars. The world seemed to spin, and the brutal reality of my situation finally hit me in full force. I had been manipulated, deceived, sold by someone I had believed to be different. Amanda, who had remained silent throughout the entire interaction, finally spoke. I warned you, she said, her voice low and tense. I didn't reply, couldn't. I simply let go of the bars and sank to the floor. Lila's face lingered in my mind, but it wasn't the face of the woman who had seduced me. It was her true face, stripped of its mask. I didn't know if I could escape, but one thing was certain. I wouldn't let Lila win, not without a fight. The darkness in the dungeon was almost absolute, broken only by flickering lights that cast distorted shadows on the stone walls. Amanda and I had spent days discussing our plan, every detail carefully thought out, despite the gaps we could only fill in the moment. Now it was time. Are you sure you can handle this? Amanda whispered, her eyes fixed on the corridor ahead. I nodded, swallowing the fear that made my throat feel like it was tied in a knot. We don't have a choice. Our first move was to wait. We had observed the guards' routines for days, their precise steps, the same paths taken over and over again. That was our only advantage, their overconfidence in the predictability of this place. As the last guard passed the corridor near our cell, Amanda stood. She was quick, her movements controlled and deliberate. Using an improvised tool, a piece of metal she had taken from one of the rusted bed frames, she managed to unlock the cell door. When the door creaked open, she froze, her eyes scanning for any sign of danger. We held our breath, the sound of our breathing muffled by the silence. Nothing, no alarms, no returning footsteps. Let's go, Amanda murmured, motioning for me to follow her. The corridors were a maze. Damp walls stretched in every direction, and the uneven floor creaked beneath our steps. Every sound seemed amplified. Every drop of water from the ceiling sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. We stayed close to the shadows, following the path we had memorized from being led to medical examinations. Amanda took the lead, stopping at every corner to listen. Sometimes, we stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound of distant footsteps to fade. Turning a corner, we found a partially open door. Amanda motioned for me to follow as we peered inside. What we saw made my stomach churn. Inside the room were stacks of metal crates, piled on top of each other. Amanda nudged the door open further, and we stepped in. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of chemicals and something organic that I didn't want to identify. Oh my God, I murmured, my voice barely audible, as Amanda opened one of the crates. Inside were human organs preserved in clear bags, hearts, kidneys, livers, all labeled as if they were products ready for shipment. This is what's waiting for us, Amanda said grimly. We closed the crate and forced ourselves to push through the horror. There was no time to waste. Farther down the corridor, We passed a larger room filled with shelves lined with documents and lists. Amanda gestured for me to stand guard while she searched. She rifled through the shelves quickly, pulling out folders and loose sheets as I kept my eyes on the corridor. Every noise made me hold my breath. "Here," she whispered, pulling out a specific sheet. I glanced over her shoulder. It was a list of names. Some were crossed out, while others were marked with words like extraction, shipment, and reevaluate. At the bottom of the page, I saw my name, Dennis Harper, evaluate for extraction. Panic surged into my throat. "Does this mean?" Amanda cut me off. "It means you're in line. We need to go before your turn comes." We pressed forward, our breaths shallow. The tension grew with every step, but the oppressive silence of the dungeon remained unbroken. As we rounded another corridor, we heard muffled voices. Amanda stopped abruptly, and we crouched, pressing ourselves against the wall. Two figures passed in the distance, talking. We couldn't catch everything, but a few words made it through. "The next delivery is late. Surgery scheduled for tomorrow. The surgeon will need 2. My eyes met Amanda's. Whatever was about to happen, it was imminent. We waited until the voices faded before moving again. We traversed a long, narrow corridor, finally arriving at a door with a grate. Amanda examined the lock but shook her head. "No tool. We'll need to find another way out." Frustration bubbled up, but before we could move, we heard a low, steady sound. A beep. Amanda followed the sound to a nearby desk, where a small screen displayed a simplified map of the dungeon. A red dot blinked slowly. "Is that cameras?" I asked, my heart racing. Amanda studied the map. "Yes, but it's not us. They're monitoring another area. Then maybe there's a control room," she concluded. It was more than we needed to know. If we found the control room, we might be able to disable the locks or at least divert their attention. We retraced our steps, the weight of the discovery and the horror of what we'd seen pressing down on our shoulders. We found the control room. The air inside was heavy, thick with tension and adrenaline. Amanda and I had managed to get in after unlocking a steel door that looked untouched for years. Inside, screens displayed images of corridors, cells, and areas I had never seen before. It was the nerve center of the entire operation, the place where this nightmare was coordinated. Amanda focused on a console, trying to make sense of the controls. There were dozens of buttons and keyboards, but none of them were self-explanatory. "Do you think you can open the doors from here?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the entrance. "Maybe," she replied, her fingers skimming over the controls. "But without a clear map, I don't know which button does what." I was about to say something when the central screen changed. Previously showing a static view of an empty corridor, it now displayed something that made my heart stop for a second. Amanda and me inside the control room. "Shit," Amanda muttered. "They know we're here." We didn't have time to think. I heard footsteps echoing in the corridor, heavy and hurried. Amanda shot me a look of panic mixed with determination. "Through the exit," she said, grabbing my arm. We bolted for the other door in the room, a marked emergency exit we had noticed upon entering. Amanda pushed it open with effort, and we spilled into a narrow corridor. The air was thick with the smell of iron and mold, but the faint light at the end hinted at a possible escape. We reached a steep staircase, and my heart pounded with the idea that we might finally be getting out. Amanda climbed first, but before I could follow, I heard a heavy sound behind me. I turned and froze. 2 guards stood in the corridor, their silhouettes filling the space. Before I could react, I felt a hard blow to my back. My body collapsed and I fell to my knees. Amanda screamed, but before she could act, one of the guards grabbed her and slammed her against the wall. "I knew you'd try something," a familiar voice echoed down the corridor. I lifted my head and saw her. Lila. She emerged from the shadows with the same elegance as always, but now there was something unmistakably predatory in her movements. Her expression held none of the charm I remembered, just a cold professionalism that made me feel small and vulnerable. Well, Dennis, she said, crossing her arms. I knew you were naive, but I didn't think you were stupid enough to actually believe you could escape. Why? I asked, my voice trembling with anger and humiliation. Why are you doing this? Who are you really? She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with amusement. My real name is Evelyn, and what I do is simple. I hunt. People like you are my favorite prey. Lonely, forgettable, so desperate for attention that you practically deliver yourselves on a silver platter. You didn't have to do this, I muttered, trying to stand. Oh, Dennis, she replied, stepping closer and crouching to my level. You still think you're special? That there's something about you worth more than the price they've put on your organs? She laughed, a chilling, malevolent sound. Do you think this was a coincidence? The moment you clicked on that stupid ad, your computer, phone, and network were infected with a virus. Every move you made was monitored, analyzed, and tailored to lead you right into our trap. This is sick, I whispered, anger boiling inside me. No, Evelyn corrected, her smile cold. It's profitable. She stood and took a few steps back, her gaze now fixed on Amanda. And you, Amanda, she continued, I have good news. We found a buyer. A black market brothel in Turkey is very interested in your talents. They'll be picking you up in 2 days. Amanda tried to lunge at her, but the guard held her firmly. You're a monster, she screamed, her voice dripping with hatred. I'm practical, Evelyn replied indifferently. And frankly, I'm not the one buying people. I just sell them. Don't be upset. It's just business. She turned back to me, her gaze icy. As for you, Dennis, your story ends much sooner. Tomorrow, the surgeon will begin his work on you. Heart, kidneys, liver, all reserved. Congratulations. Your body is worth far more than you ever were alive. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but the guards were too strong, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and helplessness. Evelyn stepped closer again, locking eyes with me and wearing that wicked smile. You should be grateful. At least now you're worth something. With that, she turned and gave instructions to the guards. Take them somewhere more secure. I don't want any more surprises. As I was dragged down the corridor, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole, but something inside me began to shift. Evelyn was right about one thing. My weakness had brought me here, but if I wanted to survive, that had to change. For the first time, fear gave way to something else, determination. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as Amanda and I were led through the damp corridors by 2 guards. Evelyn had disappeared after her taunts, but her words still echoed in my mind. Tomorrow would be my end, and Amanda would be sent to an even more horrifying fate. As we walked, my mind raced. I had come to know these corridors, every turn, every narrow passage. Evelyn and her organization thought I was weak, but I couldn't die like this, not without a fight. We turned into a dimly lit corridor, the light casting dense shadows on the walls. My heart pounded. This was the chance I'd been waiting for. In a sudden, desperate move, I twisted my body and slammed my shoulder into the guard holding my arm, shoving him against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed down the corridor. Before he could recover, I reached for the weapon holstered on his belt. The second guard moved toward me, but Amanda, acting purely on instinct, threw herself at him, grabbing his arm and stopping him from drawing his weapon. Back off, I shouted, pointing the gun at the guard I had disarmed. There was a brief moment of hesitation as the guard stared at the gun in my hands. It was all I needed. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The deafening sound reverberated through the narrow space, and the impact sent him crashing to the ground. Amanda seized the distraction to grab the second guard's weapon and struck him on the head with the butt of the gun. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Let's go, I yelled, grabbing her hand and running down the corridor. The sound of hurried footsteps and voices began to echo behind us. The organization knew something was wrong, and they were coming to stop us. We found a staircase leading upward, and the dim corridor gave way to brighter light. As we climbed, every step felt like a battle against fear and desperation. When we finally emerged, I realized where we were: the basement of Evelyn's mansion. The walls were the same as those I had seen the night I first walked in, but now the place felt even more sinister. There, Amanda pointed to a door that seemed to lead outside. Before we could reach it, a cold, familiar voice stopped us in our tracks. "Do you really think you can escape?" Evelyn. She stood at the top of the staircase, a gun in hand, her predatory gaze fixed on us. Before I could react, she fired. The shot felt like a hammer blow, tearing through the side of my arm. I screamed in pain and nearly fell, but Amanda was there to steady me. Evelyn took a few more steps toward us, her cold smile unwavering. "I told you you were predictable, Dennis, but now I'll enjoy ending this personally." Amanda acted before Evelyn could fire again. She raised the guard's gun, her eyes blazing with fury and determination. "This is for everything," Amanda said, pulling the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the mansion. Evelyn staggered backward, clutching her abdomen as blood began to stain her once pristine shirt. The shock on her face was quickly replaced by seething rage. "You won't escape this," Evelyn hissed, her voice filled with pain. "Let's see," Amanda replied, grabbing me and dragging me toward the door. Outside, the night was cold and dark, but the fresh air was an indescribable relief. We ran into the forest surrounding the mansion, never looking back. The sound of voices and footsteps chasing us faded as we pushed farther into the woods. Eventually, we stumbled upon a road. We didn't know where we were, but it didn't matter, we were far away from that place. Months later, as Amanda sleeps beside me in a motel room in a town whose name I don't know, I write these words: "We escaped, but the horror still haunts us." We've learned that Evelyn's organization is far bigger than we ever imagined. Their reach extends everywhere, even into law enforcement, which dismissed our reports and treated us like lunatics. Amanda and I have become survival partners, and now we're something more. A couple. We live on the run, moving from city to city, always looking over our shoulders. But I won't hide forever. No matter the risk, someone needs to know the truth. That's why I'm writing this account. If you're reading this, know that they're still out there, destroying lives and profiting from suffering. I hope someone sees these words and does what I couldn't: bring them down. Because even living in fear, I choose to believe that the truth can prevail.